We're now live on YouTube.
And we're up on our site. We can start.
All righty. Good evening, everyone. And I want to thank you for joining us. And today you are in store for an extremely informative webinar. Our two guest speakers have a wealth of knowledge and expertise in the field of redistricting. Before I formally introduce them, I would like to say a few words. Redistricting is a process which takes place after the census population count every 10 years. Redistricting impacts us all, whether we know it or not. The lines of a district can determine whether a community has opportunities to vote together, to elect candidates who represent their interests, or whether they are divided up in ways that dilute their influence and their collective voice. This redistricting cycle has been criticized by the media and community advocacy groups all over the city. I'm not here today to point fingers and needlessly criticize my colleagues in the state Senate and Assembly. As a staffer to an elected official at the time, I experienced firsthand how the 2010 redistricting cycle impacted the state lines in the 31st Council District, where I later became elected the council member for. As the Queensborough president, it is my duty to serve the entire borough, over 2.4 million people. The entirety of Queens is my district. For the most part, Queens is coming out of this redistricting cycle with the majority of its state district lines intact. On the other hand, it is clear that this redistricting process has failed to address the concerns of some key areas in Queens, like the Asian and South Asian communities in South Ozone Park, Richmond Hill, Elmhurst, and Woodside. The reality is we must learn from this redistricting process and ensure that we do not make the same mistakes again. I realize redistricting is not the most exciting topic to discuss, but the more New Yorkers that are informed and involved in this process, the higher the probability that things will change for your community. The objective for today is for each and every one of you to walk away from this webinar with a better understanding of how this redistricting cycle went and what is in store for Queens district lines for the next 10 years. I urge you all to share the information that you learned here today with your family, friends, and community members. Be sure to ask questions, engage in dialogue, and reach out to my office if you need any additional support or resources. We are here to ensure that you and your community members have all the information that you need. With that, it is time to introduce our two speakers who have joined us here today. First, I would like to introduce the godfather of redistricting, Jeffrey M. Weiss, who is an adjunct professor and senior fellow at the New York Law School, where he directs the New York Census and Redistricting Institute. Professor Weiss has been a partner to the Queensborough President's Office for the past 4 years, serving as an advisor to the Queens Complete Count Committee during the 2020 census, and now the Queens Civic Engagement Committee. I don't mean to date him, but this is his 5th redistricting cycle. Professor Weiss has also served as counsel to the last 2 New York City Council redistricting commissions. Following Professor Weiss, we were lucky to have my good friend, John Albert, who is the founder of Taking Our Seat, a Queens-based South Asian American advocacy organization. John has more than 20 years of experience as an advocate for New York City's leading nonprofits. John was raised and currently resides in the best borough in New York City, Queens, with his wife and 2 children, where he is deeply connected to the fabric of the community through his leadership positions in Queens-focused political and civic organizations. On behalf of the residents of Queens, thank you both for all your work and for joining us here today. It gives me great honor to now open the floor to Professor Weiss, who will get us started. And if you have Q&A, I know that Tim is gonna take Q&A out of the box. We ask everybody to remain respectful through dialogue, and we're gonna try to get through as many questions as we can through this process. With that being said, it gives me great honor to now introduce Professor Weiss.
I get unmuted there. Well, thank you very much, Borough President, and good to see my friend John Albert, and thank you to Tim Shibanutsi for setting up this event. We've had several webinars on redistricting, and I must say, having worked all across New York City and New York State, that the borough president's office in Queens has been the most engaged, both in redistricting, census, and civic interest across the board. So my congratulations to you for that. What I'll do is spend my time giving you a summary of what happened with redistricting, where things stand, what went right, what went wrong, why did it happen, and then what's happening next. And I'll just touch a little bit upon the city council process, because if the state process has taken this long and it's ended because petitioning starts tomorrow for the new district lines for Congress, for the legislature, for candidates to go out, hit the streets and get petitions to run for office in the spring primary. Within the next week, Mayor Eric Adams will be appointing his members to a New York City Council manic redistricting process. And that's going to take us all the way through December of this year. So we've got at least 10 more months of this in store. And after that's over, we get ready for the 2030 census, which Queens is well prepared to do. So I'm going to use a PowerPoint to go through my presentation, and I'll start that now. Okay. So I'll give you, this might not be the 30,000 foot view of redistricting, but maybe 5 or 10,000 feet up. I'll show you a bit of where we've been, why it happened, what's going on now, and where it's going next. So to summarize, in 2014, New York voters approved a constitutional amendment to change the way the Congressional, State Senate, and State Assembly lines are redrawn. Prior to this decade, prior to this year, lines were simply drawn as bills by the legislature. The Senate and Assembly had a committee, they'd hold hearings, they'd solicit input, but the lines were drawn by legislators, passed by the Assembly and Senate, and signed by the governor into law. This decade not only brought in a new system, but for the first time since 1911, and 1911 was really an aberration, the Democrats controlled both chambers of the legislature as well as the governor's office. That's rarely happened in state history, but we saw it 10 years ago briefly. We saw it back in the 1930s, 40s for very brief periods of time. But now government is a Democratic trifecta in Albany. So a lot of different factors came together in this year's redistricting. But essentially, the amendment that passed in 2014 created a 10-member commission. On paper, it was called the Independent Redistricting Commission. The members were appointed in large part by the Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, and the two minority leaders. They each got to appoint 2 members. That totaled 8. And those 8 members then selected 2 additional members who could be neither Republicans or Democrats to round out the 10. The 10 members were tasked with developing one set of maps for Congress and one set of maps for the legislature. They had a very complicated method to approve a plan. They basically had to have approval by 7 of 10 members, of which at least one appointee of each of the 4 legislative leaders supported a plan. That was done to achieve bipartisan support. And on paper, once the commission agreed to one set of maps, they'd be sent to the legislature. The Assembly, the Senate would take votes. If the plans were approved, they go to the governor for approval. If the plans were rejected by either chamber, then the commission would be tasked with developing a second set of maps. So what happened was on January 3rd, actually, on January 3rd, the commission met and failed to agree on a single set of Senate, Assembly, and congressional maps. Instead, they split 5 Democratic and 5 Republicans to suggest a Republican set of plans and a Democratic set of plans. So we had 2 Assembly Senate maps and 2 congressional maps go to the legislature. About a month or so ago, month and a half ago, the legislature rejected both of those plans and told the commission, go back, you have 15 days, come back to us with a second set of maps. Well, within that 2-week period, the commission failed to agree on a second set of maps. They simply started pointing fingers at each other. The Democrats said the Republicans were tying things up. The Republicans said it was the Democrats' fault. They got nowhere. The commission basically imploded. So in failing to agree on a second set of maps, the commission's role basically terminated. At that point, the state legislature picked up where the commission left off and developed maps that followed the same criteria that the commission was assigned to follow. The first was equal population, that each district be generally equipopulous. That's the one person, one vote standard, that each of our districts had to be equal in population to all of the other districts. Also, the second criteria was that minority voting rights be honored, that you make sure that there are proper districts to reflect minority voting strength under the Voting Rights Act or under communities of interest arguments. And the first two requirements, equal population and minority voting rights, are federal standards. But then the state constitution in its 2014 amendment added additional criteria that include that districts be compact, meaning that they be rather square or round or rectangular, but not have 57 different ragged edges, as some of the districts in Brooklyn and Queens had under the plan enacted in 2012. Another criteria was that districts be contiguous, that you be able to go from one end of a district to another and not leave the district. Districts were also supposed to follow keeping communities of interest intact. A community of interest is something that people who live in a neighborhood self-define, whether they be socioeconomic or racial or medical or educational, that you create districts where people identify with each other and have like-minded interests, where they shop, where they go to school, where they worship, and those sorts of things. Then you had criteria that the cores of the pre-existing districts be adhered to an extent possible. And then finally, that districts not favor or disfavor political parties or candidates. Now, these criteria were not ranked in priority order, so the legislature was left with a balancing act. Having practiced in this area for a few years, I can tell you that you cannot achieve each of these criteria equally, that there were trade-offs. And that's what the legislature had to deal with to reflect the increase of over 620,000 people that were added to the population rolls in New York City, and balanced against the major population losses we saw in counties in upstate New York. So New York City, which usually we thought was undercounted by at least 250,000 in each of the last 5 or 6 censuses, picked up 600,000 people, mainly because the New York City Planning Department was able to identify every mailing address possible in each of the boroughs, and the mayor's office kicked in with the support of the city council and the work of the borough president's offices, a $40 million effort just in New York City alone. So a lot of the reasons that the maps reflected the changes that were made were based on the population growth in the downstate area. So a few weeks ago, Governor Hochul approved the new maps passed by the Senate and Assembly for Congressional, Senate and Assembly districts. So the maps are now law, and tomorrow being March 1st, petitioning will get underway for candidates who want to run in the June 28th primary for the Assembly, Senate, and Congress. Now, one thing we've seen in New York every decade are lawsuits filed against redistricting maps, especially at the legislative level. So on February 3rd, the day the governor signed the bills, a lawsuit was filed against the maps. In the lawsuit in state Supreme Court, 14 Republican affiliated voters from across the state filed a challenge to the new congressional plans. They're also trying to amend their petition to also challenge the state Senate plans. And they filed their lawsuit in Steuben County State Supreme Court. And the reason they went up to Steuben County was basically that you try to find judges who you think would be sympathetic to your cause. Steuben County, which is situated on the southern tier of New York State along the Pennsylvania border, south of Rochester and Syracuse, is a heavily Republican county. And there are 3 or 4 state Supreme Court justices there who were elected as Republican conservative candidates. So they thought they might get a lucky break and get a favorable judge. There's a judge there named Pat McAllister, and he only has until April 3rd to make a decision. The state constitution includes a requirement now that the judge only take 60 days to decide the case. Now, this is, for all intents, March 1st is tomorrow, which means that he has to decide within just over a month's time. And he won't even have his first in-court motions hearing to hear the arguments on how the case ought to proceed, not necessarily even the merits, but how to proceed, procedural arguments this Thursday morning in Bath, New York. Bath is where the courthouse is located in Steuben County. And the lawsuit essentially argues 2 things. The first is that it maintains that the legislature didn't have the power to redistrict. And the thinking there on the part of the plaintiffs, New York, we called them the petitioners, was that the Constitution directed the commission to submit a second set of maps for the legislature to consider and vote on up or down. And that if the legislature then votes to approve or to reject the plan, then the legislature can actually draw a third plan by itself if the second plan was rejected. And because there was no second plan for the legislature to vote on, they don't have the power to act. But interestingly, the legislature did pass a bill last June that says if the commission fails to vote on a plan, we then have the power to follow up. And that's just what happens. So the first question the judge has to consider is whether the legislature had the ability to draw the maps. If it doesn't, then they'll argue the judge himself should draw the maps, and the judge with a Republican background might draw plans favorable to the Republican Party. But that's ahead of us. And then the second argument that they make, in case the judge says that the legislature did have the power to redistrict, was that the congressional map was a partisan gerrymander. And a gerrymander, or it's known as gerrymander, that takes place when a plan is drawn to favor one political party over another. And the plan is alleged to have favored the Democrats over the Republicans. Because the petitioners failed to challenge the Senate plan in their February 3rd complaint, then they've amended their paperwork, and they're going to ask the court if they could also add a challenge to the Senate plan to the complaint against the Congressional plan. So these are the big 2 issues that the court is dealing with. Now, the respondents, that means the defendants, that's Speaker Carl Hastie, Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins, they're asking the court several things in response. The first is that the court should just dismiss this case, that it's not based in facts, that's not based in the law. That often happens in litigation. So the judge has to decide whether there's merit or weight to the case. They also argue that the petitioners, the plaintiffs, don't have the standing to bring the case. I mentioned that there were 14 people bringing the challenge from across New York State, but only one of the 14 plaintiffs actually lives in a district that allegedly was drawn to favor Democrats over Republicans or to disadvantage Republicans. So they're saying you've got to live in the district where you're making the challenge. Oftentimes cases are dismissed because the plaintiffs didn't belong in court. So that's another interesting question. And then we discovered in the respondents or the defendants' answers that the petitioner's own expert who submitted a report, an analysis, demonstrated that even the plans that he drew would favor the Democrats, that the plan enacted by the state actually was a plan that Republicans would do better off under than under the plans the Republican plaintiff's own expert was submitting to the court. Therefore, the question is, what are they doing here in the first place? Don't they know what they're up to? So the judge has a bunch of questions that he'll be considering beginning on Thursday. Now, what happens next? Well, tomorrow, midnight, just a few hours away, candidates will begin petitioning for office. The judge could dismiss the case. He won't even hear the case until Thursday, March 3rd. That's 2 days after petitioning starts. And the US Supreme Court has often ruled that courts should not interfere with elections once the election process has already started. So the judge could also find parts of the plan illegal and order the legislature to fix the plan where it's necessary. If the legislature fails to do that, then the judge could appoint a special master, a qualified political scientist or attorney who's done work in this area to draw the plan for the court. Most likely, if the judge does find a problem with the plan, then he could allow the new lines, the ones that were approved back in early February, to go forward and be used this year. And that if he does find something violative of the law in the plan, he can call for a new plan for the 2024 elections. Now, to complicate things further in the mix, any decision that Judge McAllister makes can be appealed to the appellate division, the Intermediate Appeals Court, and ultimately to the New York State Court of Appeals. This could take months, could take until the end of the year. So we won't really know what's going to happen next, if anything at all, until at least sometime on Thursday. Now, what happens in court in New York? Well, I've looked at every court case, every court challenge for the last 50 or 60 years. You know, the courts didn't even hear cases involving redistricting or challenges to maps, not until 1962 in a very famous case called Baker versus Carr, where the Supreme Court held that these cases are something that the courts can actually hear. But since then, goes back now to the 1960s, no state or federal court has rejected any legislatively enacted redistricting plan in New York State, with one minor exception where Congressmember Nydia Velazquez's district, which covers part of Queens, had to be rounded out back in 1997 because of a minor glitch that many states had to deal with in the late 1990s. The courts in New York hold challenges to a very high bar of proof that a redistricting plan can be found illegal only if it violates the law in what the lawyers call beyond a reasonable doubt, and if the legislature acted in bad faith. That's very hard to do. And in 1992, the State Court of Appeals even allowed the 1992 State Senate plan to be used, despite that plan unnecessarily splitting counties all across upstate New York. So, for the challengers to knock out the plan, it's going to be tough. Not saying it can't happen, because there is a new law in place that the judge could decide to read one way, but that's also something we can't tell at this point. And when that's not even when that's all over yet, but we go right into New York City Council redistricting. A 15-member commission will be appointed by the mayor, the council speaker, and the minority leader. And their process is going to take us all the way through December 2022, December of this year. Speaker Adrian Adams, Council Minority Leader Joe Borelli have already made their appointments to the commission. And by March 7th, Mayor Eric Adams will make his remaining 7 appointments. And then the commission at the New York City level will kick into place. In New York City, the districts, unlike at the state level, have to follow prioritized and ranked criteria, which makes it much harder for for the City Council Commission to bring politics or any kind of favoritism into the process. I expect the commission will get underway sometime next month. By the late spring, you'll see a hearing in each of the boroughs scheduled for public input. And if history is any lesson, you'll see one in Queens, one in each of the 5 boroughs. The council can then review and the input and and release a plan in July, which the city council can then review and suggest changes to. The commission will then go back and hold more public hearings. I would guess hearings in July or August or before Labor Day. They'll come back with a second plan, and that gets submitted to the city clerk. And unless within 3 weeks the city council votes it down, which has never happened before, that plan will go into law. So unlike the state commission, where there was very little, independence, the commission was beholden to the legislature. The city council commission is much more independent. And that will take us through the end of this year. I'll also mention that unlike the state legislative level, where challenges have been brought in court every 10 years, there hasn't been a single challenge to the New York City Council redistricting in 20 years because it's a much different, much tighter, in my opinion, much better process. So that brings me to an end, and we'll do questions and answers afterwards, but I've listed my email address here if anybody wants to write to me with any questions afterwards. So thank you very much, and go on to the next speaker.
Hi, everyone, and Jeffrey's a hard act to follow because what you've got is really kind of everything you need to know about redistricting. And so I know that they're in the chat. There are a number of questions and because of that information. And so we'll get to those. And my presentation is very much based purely on the maps. And so I just want to get to the maps and hopefully you can see what I'm looking at right now. And so if you're seeing what I'm seeing right now, it's a map of our beloved New York City. And as I zoom in into our more beloved Queens County,
John,
right? And
sorry, it's not on the screen right now.
Oh, it's not on the screen. Okay, bear with me 1 second.
There we go.
Okay, sorry about that. And now is it? Can
You're
you see
good.
it?
Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you. Sorry about that. So I said, beloved New York, more beloved Queens. And the reason, just a plug for Queens, I always say I'm proud to be from Queens and raise my kids here. It's because no matter what's happening around the world, the people of Queens are united. And we stand together because we know a couple of basic facts, right? We believe in democracy and diversity, and we also know how to stand up and fight for it. So I want to thank you all for joining this, because among the ways you stand up for democracy is to get educated about topics like this. I think the borough president, I kind of smirked when he said that it's, I don't know if he called it exciting. It's exciting to me and to Jeffrey, and I hope it's exciting for all of you as well. So I just wanted to, talk to you very simply about what lines were actually drawn, right? And so taking a look at this particular screen, and you can, and I'll put this in the chat later. It's just redistrictinginu.org. So you can take a look at this if we kind of fly by some of this, considering the time that we have. And so I just want to draw your attention to some, some particular interesting items. So one of the things that we talked about, or Jeffrey talked about, was the Nydia Velasquez case, right? And so I thought I'd just elevate that. So this is the way that Nydia Velasquez's district used to look, right? So she was here, and she did at one point have have a little bit of Queens right here, and this is her base in Queens was really Ridgewood. And so what you see here in the congressional plan that was adopted is she actually expands a lot more into Queens. And so that means that that Nydia Velasquez, we will have to get to know her, and I think she will have to get to know more of us. One of the interesting things here is you see that Nydia Velasquez's new district now really, and I'm going to see if I can zoom in a little bit here, really takes in a lot more parts of what this is. You see Richmond Hill here, but a lot of Ozone Park, and so this is one of those districts that we talk about. One of the interesting things to me about Queens is that we share population with among other elected officials for. Bear with me while I move these. We share elected officials with other boroughs. So Nydia Velasquez is a classic case. We share her with Brooklyn and with Manhattan, right? Same here with Carolyn Maloney. This is her district as drawn. You can see she actually lost a lot of Queens, and so she actually shrinks closer, right, to the waterfront here in Astoria, and so. You can see it kind of just shift over to the purple. So Carolyn Maloney's district, District 12, here we are, it gets less of us, right? So another district I think people had a lot of, kept their eyes on was the 14th. And this, as you know, is Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's district. I'm just zooming in here. These are her new lines. It's interesting. I mean, and so she always had Queens in the Bronx, and she continues to have Queens in the Bronx, but it changes slightly, as you can tell from this, right? So she's actually gains a lot of the population that that Congresswoman Maloney is losing. What's interesting here, and I think Jeffrey had touched upon this, among the reasons that, and I think you guys have heard this, is because of the census, we actually lost one congressional member. And that's because overall as a state, we lost population, but that wasn't the case in Queens. Queens gained population and gained population, particularly in the Asian American community. And so that's why you see some of this shifting where we're getting more of them for the most part, right? The interesting part, this is Grace Meng's district. Now it's wholly in Queens. This is Greg Meeks's district. And this includes parts of Long Island and the big chunk of Southeast Queens where he has his political base. But the really interesting thing in Congress, I think, is what I call this coastal district. And it has parts of Douglaston and Douglas Manor. I mean, that's Fort Totten. I'm trying to think of exact neighborhood that's called. It's Bayside, but there's probably some name that I'm missing here. These are all the coastal communities in Nassau County, parts of Queens, are kind of jog up to the Bronx and then into Westchester. This is a really interesting drawing of this, and maybe in the discussion we can talk about why this was. But this has already garnered interest from among the reasons that it was drawn. One was the incumbent Tom Suozzi has announced that he's not running for re-election, and what was interesting is that of the people that are running, the majority of them are from Nassau County, but there was an announcement from Senator Biaggi in the Bronx that she is going to run for this seat as well. So it's just really interesting that Queens is used really as a bridge here between a Nassau County and a Westchester County district. I think the vast majority of the population is there, as you can tell on the map. So just shifting very quickly over to the Senate. as you can tell, I'm going to just scoot here. The interesting thing the interesting thing here, and I mentioned this, is that Queens not only gains a little bit of population, but gains density within the Asian American community. And so that allows some of the redistricting commission, the LAT4, to actually draw an incumbent-free Senate district. And so this is that district here. It's really interesting to me in terms of, let's see, if you use redistricting in U to go through this, it talks about who the incumbent was, but in this case, it doesn't really apply here because Joe Adabo used to have that number, but he didn't have exactly those locations. So if you look to your right here, this is the proposed plan. There, total population is 319,000, so just 1,000 people roughly below the average, and again, very small deviation. This is really an interesting population, as you can see from this on the lower right-hand corner here. It tells you what's the total population and the breakout, but it also tells you what the voting age population is. And so, for many folks who are running for office, they're really interested in how many eligible voters there are, and this gives you a good sense of that and what the racial breakdown is. And so as you can, if you're watching this race, or if you're watching this district closely, you'll notice that there are multiple people who have thrown their hat in the ring. To me, it's very interesting because it's so economically diverse and geographically diverse, right? It comes parts of Queens right on the waterfront there, so Long Island City, over into Maspeth, down into Glendale, and over into parts of Richmond Hill. Even though the numbers say, right, that that it was Joe Adabo's district. This is district now where Joe Adabo actually lives, is also an equally interesting district to me. This is parts of Forest Hills, then jogs down here, as you can tell, Kew Garden Hills, over into South, using South Ozone Park and Ozone Park and Howard Beach as a bridge down into the Rockaways, right? So this is also a really interesting district here. So those were two of the ones that look decidedly different. There are a couple of other things that I do want to bring to your attention. If you were here at the last presentation, I really drew attention to this formulation here. So this is the old district map lines, and you can tell this is the interplay on Hillside Avenue between Leroy Comrie's district here, and you can't even make out, and then this is John Liu's district here, right? So this, I don't know exactly what the word for this is, shambles of small blocks here making up these districts have really been smoothed out. And so you can see here, the line is far more clear. And so I think you can get a sense that there's just more smoother lines, right? So this is Leroy Comrie's district, jogging just on Hillside Avenue. This is Toby Stavisky's district currently, or as drawn, and this is John Liu's district here. So what you're doing is you're smoothing out these lines. If you know the history of this, you know that the in 2012, when this was being drawn, the Republicans were having, I think, a grand old time, just making it as confusing as possible. And so this was intentionally drawn, of course, just as you can tell, smoothing it out a little bit here. So just jumping into the assembly for a minute, so we can keep to time here. One of the areas that was probably the most talked about in any of the media coverage was Richmond Hill, Ozone Park, and South Ozone Park. I'm going to bring up the old lines just so you saw what it was like. So this is the neighborhood that we're talking about. I hope you can see and so it's broken up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 districts, depending on how you see it, maybe even 7. And so this neighborhood became the poster child across the state for what they called cracking a neighborhood, which is you split the neighborhood into multiple districts where no one part of that neighborhood has any specific power in the respective district that they're located in. So the community really organized and was able to, I would say it's an incremental step forward. And as I think the borough president talked about, not everything, you don't get everything that you want, but you could see that it's far more smoothly. It's cut down into kind of like 3, right? Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park here, the 3 and 4, right? So this was a major focus for advocates. Among the things, though, I think that was interesting to me is the addition of a Asian American district, a majority district, as you can tell here. I'm just bringing this. I just want to bring this to your attention. So if you can look at over here on the right hand side, the total population. You can see this is an Asian American district. What's interesting, though, is this is the Asian American district was drawn, but not in the way that Asian American groups had asked for this list to be drawn. There's a very large Filipino and Thai community on the border of this district, and the community had organized to include more of this area here. So this is interesting, and again, I would say an incremental win for advocates who are asking for these kinds of changes. But this district is really something that to keep an eye on for those who are interested in the politics and the tumult that follows redistricting. An interesting thing for me was, and this is around the neighborhoods that I live in, was how Eastern Queens was handled. As you could tell previously, this is Glen Oaks and Belrose, and these areas again get smoothed out, but not in any way that keeps the neighborhoods whole or together. So again, still split in 2 over here, but smoothing out some of these lines. I am going to just zoom back out, and I'm going to stop sharing here, because I know once the map gets into it, people have quite specific questions on maps. But maybe Tim, we can talk about or answer questions for Jeff first, because if I have to employ the map, then I can just jump back to the map. But
yeah. And if I could show one other thing on the map that John was working with, it's just a feature that people will probably find very interesting. So let me bring my version of it up. Give me a second. Let's see. I'll be there in a moment. Okay, let me just share my screen, and I'll show you one more feature of this map, which is really useful. Okay, do you all see the map? Okay, I take it you all see it since I don't see you. If you go to this website, which is newyork.redistrictingandyou.org, and you go over on the left here where it says legend, and you click on that, and then you scroll down on the left side here to where it says voting age, race, Hispanic origin, and click on that, then you're going to see the actual racial composition within a district. So just pull it up a little bit. So you can see here, and I guess this is the Elmhurst area, the Hispanic, the Black, the white, the Asian population. So just another tool that you can work with on this great website.
Thank you, Jeff. So we'll jump into a few questions that came for you, and I'll go from kind of the top down from order that we received them. So could you touch on a bit more the prioritize and ranked criteria areas that you were touching upon earlier in your presentation?
Sure. Well, the state constitutional criteria were not ranked or prioritized. It was a balancing act that the legislature had to use its policymaking judgments to determine. The city council charter, the city charter does have ranked criteria. The reason I didn't get into it was that I think Tim has promised we'll have future webinars on the New York City Council process where we can go into that in much more detail. But essentially, with the city process, you have to achieve, first off, population equality. Second, you have to maintain or create the requisite number of minority districts. Then you have very specific criteria on compactness, that no council district can be twice as long as it is wide. You have rules limiting how many times a district can cross borough or county boundaries. You have exact mathematical limits on what you can or can't do in a prioritized order. So in a practical sense, having worked on the last two council redistrictings, once you draw the necessary number of minority districts, then you're by drawing minority districts that are required under federal law, you've got to cross the Brooklyn-Queens border. You've got to cross the Manhattan Bronx border. That way you're complying with the Voting Rights Act. There's a district in Ridgewood, along the Ridgewood Bushwick border. There's a council district in East Harlem and South Bronx. So that although the charter limits the number of counties that can be crossed, the Voting Rights Act requires it. And then after you comply with the Voting Rights Act, you find that as you move along the Brooklyn waterfront, you can't create districts that are necessarily very compact because they'll go into the water, into New York Harbor. So you get to be a little bit more lenient as you go further down the criteria that you're not required to be as strictly adhered to. And we'll get into a whole demonstration of this hopefully in a future webinar.
Thank you, Jeff. Next question here is a two-part question. During their deliberations, were the members of the Independent Redistricting Commission somehow left out without adult supervision? Having failed in their mission, can we assume the members of the IRC ultimately worked pro bono?
Well, the members of the commission were, to my knowledge, pretty much firewalled off from working with anyone except themselves. The legislature wanted to give them as much independence as possible. That although in the court case in Steuben, the plaintiffs are seeking to find out how much interplay there was between the commission members and the legislature, the commission really worked independently on its own, and they were given a very tough job. I mean, to get 7 votes of 10 members, where you have to have one appointee of each of the 4 legislative leaders to agree, that's tough. And I think when the plan was developed back in 2012 by essentially the Republican leadership in the state Senate, they knew what they were doing. They knew that this commission, if it failed, would throw the power right back to the legislature, where very frankly, and I'll speak candidly, the then Republican majority thought that they'd still be in power today. But no one ever expected that the Democrats would have a 2/3 majority vote, plus the governor's office in both chambers. Tim, you're on mute.
Thank you for that, Professor. Next up, we have here, how will the city level initiative, the recent Voting Rights Act for immigrants, I believe is what this person is referring to vote in the municipal elections affect the New York City Council redistricting process? Will that have an impact?
Not right now, because the districts that are drawn now will be based on the 2020 census data. That data includes everybody who was counted regardless of their citizenship status. So the numbers that are being used to draw the lines and the numbers that were used to draw the state lines and will be used for the city lines, they include citizens and non-citizens alike. Everybody who was living in New York was counted. The real test for that will come in the 2023 city council elections to see how big an impact non-citizen voters actually have. But at this point, non-citizen voting hasn't been tested yet. And the numbers, however, do reflect their presence in the city.
The last one here before we pass it over to John. 1 second. Congressional District 3 crosses 3 county lines, including Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk. How is this like interests?
Well, they're claiming that this is as John mentioned, a coastal district, that it takes into consideration the like-minded interests of Westchester, Bronx, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk. That's actually 5 counties that share Long Island Sound water interests. That's what they're calling it.
To quickly piggyback off of that, since Phil raised a similar kind of question, has there ever been a congressional district that includes 5 counties within New York State?
Well, upstate New York, there are several because of the expanse of people, that are sparsely populated compared to New York City. So, but if you look at downstate New York, not that I can recall. I've only been doing this since the 1980s. We have had districts that included, of course, Queens, Nassau, Suffolk. We had districts with Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and Staten Island and Brooklyn, or Staten Island and New York counties. But I don't recall when this crossed 5 county lines set in the 12 downstate counties in a while. And I doubt there ever were any, but maybe in the early 1800s. I'd have to go back and look.
Great, thank you for that. We'll switch over to a few directly map-related questions for you, John. And just so everyone is aware, this redistricting NU map was not created by John, so don't kind of hold him accountable for any critiques.
But so just one thing, one of the questions I read was just about getting down to street level. That map actually does get down to street level. I was keeping it 30,000 foot perspective, just so we can see the whole, neighborhood and perspective and see it in context of Queens as a whole. But for those of you, when you take a look at it, you can zoom down right down to the street level and find your homes. And I think someone asked, you can find out where you live. You just zoom down. It doesn't have I don't believe it has a address search function there, but if you can find your block, then you can figure out which district you're in just by toggling between all of these the various lines.
Thank you for clarifying that. If it's okay with you, can we jump into some specific districts that folks have brought up? So
Sure.
The first one here is asking, has Jamaica Estates been affected by the redrawing of the lines?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Jamaica Estates resident, so I kind of know this. So District 24, which is the Assembly District, it remains roughly the same for the Assembly. Greg Meeks is, for the most part, our Congress member, and he maintains that portion for us as the Jamaica State residents. I think what you're really seeing here on the state Senate side is not changes to our part, right? Jamaica State's part of John Lew's Senate district, but rather you see all the neighborhoods around us change in John Lew's district. So again, that's smoothing out of Jamaica Hill and Briarwood and those areas is what you see. So for that, I know because I live here. I cannot speak with that specificity in all neighborhoods, so I'd have to refer back to the map. But that's the case for Jamaica Estates.
Great, thank you. Could you give Assembly District 30 a shot?
Sure, so let me go back to the screen. Bear with me 1 second. So I'm just zooming out. So you can see the streets here, right? Sorry, I just so folks know that I'm wasn't
Yes.
fitting. There you are, you can see the streets. 30, if I recall correctly, is down here. Right, is this 30? Sorry, no, this is why. Bear with me for 1 second. 30, sorry, here it is. So I'm just going to zoom in here, and this was that neighborhood, that district that I spoke about, and so just this is the Elmhurst Woodside district. Was there a specific question about 30 that I should address? So here you are, maybe just walking you through. This is the northern portion, and so you can see this is the cemetery, and then this is the BQE coming right down the center of it, and Queens Boulevard, and encompasses most of Elmhurst, and actually comes down to just near Glendale. So I hope this is the kind of, but for those, I think this is the kind of detail that you can find yourself as you zoom in on these when you have the opportunity.
Thank you,
Tim,
Jeff.
was there something specific?
I think maybe they were referring to the change from the 2010.
Change. Okay, yeah. So let's just this is interesting, right? Because I picked a central spot in that district. Was actually it's interesting because to me this was the most significant change, right? So if you live right in the center or in the edge of, I believe this is I would say a mashup of Gonzales Rojas and Barnwell in some ways, and I think that may be the best way to look at it in terms of who the incumbents are.
Great, thank you. And I know everyone would like their assembly district or state district covered. Unfortunately, we won't get a chance to cover every single one of them, but I will put my email address in the chat. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot me an email after the webinar, and I'll definitely follow up with you individually. So let's go on to the next question here from a very vocal community group in Queens. Amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, the Caribbean Equality Project played an essential role in getting South Asian and Indo-Caribbean people counted in the 2020 census in South Queens, particularly in Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park. We saw our advocacy and voices silenced during the 2021 New York State redistricting cycle. What role could the 3 current assembly members have played in keeping Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park united?
So yeah, thank you for that, because I was part of that, the advocacy, and so it was disappointing. This wasn't the formulation I think many of the community wanted. One of the ways to think about this, and then this is really understanding the 2 things, right? One was that the Voting Rights Act requires that in some ways to maintain the majority of the minority group, right? So in some ways, if I can explain this in the simplest ways that I know, the Indo-Caribbean and South Asian communities are not the protected communities under the Voting Rights Act. And so when you look at the redistricting through that lens, in some ways, that the neighborhood has a significant Latino and African-American population, which are explicitly protected by the Voting Rights Act. And so in that sequence, right, you get a result like this, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is the districts can only be 100 and, I want to say 132,000. The low end is like 124, 136 is higher. And so what ends up happening is when you have, among the reasons that Professor Weiss mentioned was that within the process, the elected officials themselves have a say in what this looks like. So unless there's someone who's completely willing to give up 136,000 people, what you have to do is you have to be able to cobble together many of these communities. I think that those district lines are, they're disappointing. That's not what any of us who are advocating in that area asked for. But I think in that, the way that it's come out reflects this kind of push and pull between the limitation on size, the order in which the Voting Rights Act protects Indo-Caribbeans and South Asians, and just the way that the local elected officials maintained the core groups of their previous districts. And so I think that's why you get that result. That's why you move from, it could have gone from 6 to 2, but unfortunately it ended up to 6 to 3, which is still a step forward, but not ideal.
Thank you for that. And let me know if you want to take this one or pass it on to Jeff. How was a community's economic profile considered in the redistricting decision?
Well, I'll give it an answer that on a community by community, district by district basis, we don't know because the legislature didn't provide reasons. It may come out in litigation where they have to defend the plan, but essentially the legislature argues that it put communities of interest together where it could, but given other balancing criteria requirements, they always couldn't, you can't do everything, both an objective and subjective phrase. It's what you make of it, what you convince others it ought to be.
Thank you for that. And piggybacking off of communities of interest, may you please expand further on the consideration for communities of interest?
Well, during the hearing process that the State Commission undertook, scores of witnesses talked about how their communities ought to be or ought not to be joined together. And we had mixed results coming out of both the commission and the legislature on that. But it was one of several criteria that did not take precedence or priority over other criteria. And again, there was no real legislative explanation as to what they've done. So you have to go on faith that this was a public policy decision based on population equality, other factors that they took into consideration to balance things. There's a domino effect that when you move something to be whole in one area, something else falls apart elsewhere. So at some point, you've got to say, this is the plan. This plan meets population requirements. This plan meets Minority Voting Rights Act requirements, and as many other criteria as we can possibly accommodate, but not everything, and call it quits.
Thank you. We'll take another one that was asked for you, Professor Weiss. Since 1980, has community input at public hearings resulted in meaningful changes in the redrawing of maps in New York City?
Well, I'll tell you one change that was made almost instantaneously. There was a hearing in 1992 in Borough Hall in Queens over a proposed map. And the map for the assembly I believe, split the community at the foot of the Whitestone Bridge in half. And I'm blanking on the name of the community. I'll recognize it as soon as one of you tell me. But when the entire community showed up and said that we've split this community in half, we put it right back together again as fast as we could. That's just one example, but yes and no. Again, it's a balancing act that if the new districts that John talked about in Queens, the Hispanic Senate District and the Asian Senate District, that those were due in large part to community concerns to create better opportunities for the Asian and Hispanic residents. But we didn't necessarily, I just saw Corey Beer, Malba, thank you, who split Malba. But we saw some of the fix made in Ozone Park, Richmond Hill for the Asian community. So it does make a difference, but if you don't come to the hearings, if you don't speak up, then you're less likely to get what you want regardless. So for the upcoming New York City Council hearings, it's incumbent on everybody to show up, testify. It's a different process. It's a more community-driven process, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you, Jeff. And we'll take just a couple of more questions. So if folks have any more questions, now is the time to write them into the chat. This one is for you, John. If we could go back to the map, could you pull up the state district lines for Whitestone, College Point, and Beechhurst?
Sure. Bear with me 1 second. Please let me know if you see it. Okay.
You're good.
All right, here we are going into Beechhurst. This is 27. And so again, what this district does is it starts in Kew Garden Hills and then travels north through the park. I don't believe anyone is living here or should be living here. And then here into College Point. And I don't know if there's a specific follow-up here on these, on this district, in these district lines. Tim, was there a specific question, or they just wanted to see it? Okay,
yes.
But again, I really urge you guys, I mean, I love maps. I was a kid, I have hundreds of maps and flags all over my room. This is the springboard to my interest in all of this work. And so, I go through these maps all the time because it's really fascinating to me. This is one of those fascinating districts, connecting neighborhoods that, it's interesting to say the least. But here we are.
And to echo what John just said, this is a very interactive map. Folks, feel free to utilize it after this webinar. We can't cover every single district today, but you'll have an opportunity at your own time to go through every single district and compare and contrast. And there are plenty, as you can see, there are plenty of toggles you can turn off and on, and it's super interactive and easy to navigate through. So we'll take another quick question here. Do either of you anticipate that a separate court challenge will be made for the new makeup of Community District 3 to Congressional District 3, excuse me, to protest those who live in the few blocks in Bay Terrace? Who will be represented by the same representative who speaks for Huntington and Port Chester?
Right. So this is Bay Terrace here. Just so I'm just drawing the people's attention to the map here, and I will let Jeff then.
Well, it's a little bit late now to challenge the plan to impact this year's elections. It's probably too late, but a challenge could be brought any time of the decade. The question I have for the questioner is, what grounds would you challenge it under? I could suggest, but don't advocate necessarily, that this district is not compact. It is contiguous because it does use the Throgs Neck Bridge to connect, but you'd have to find a reason to challenge the map. But you have until 2022 to do so. and in state court.
Thank you, Jeff. And I believe that echoes what the borough president has said at the beginning, that it's very important to stay consistent and stay involved in this process, because if you don't make your voice heard for your community, it's tough for the folks who organize this process to know exactly how to shape these districts. So it covers everyone's interests. Although it's not possible to please everyone, they certainly do their best. With that, I want to be sensitive of everyone's time. This is a very heavy topic with lots of opinions and concerns and questions, so we'll keep the dialogue going. I just put my email in the chat. Folks, feel free to reach out to me anytime, and I'll get you the appropriate answers and resources. With that, I'd like to thank both Professor Weiss and John Albert for taking the time and coming and presenting to us here today. As you can see in the chat, lots of conversation, lots of folks found this very informative and beneficial. And on behalf of the borough president and the residents of Queens, thank you both so very much. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel at QBPO Press, so folks can review this anytime. And thank you both so very much.